A warming climate and fast-growing urban areas are accelerating changes in the environment. Intense storms, floods, wildfires, and drought are occurring more frequently. As sea level rise and natural disasters multiply, governments, city planners, insurers need to predict the impact these events have, as well as which solutions could help lessen the blow. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Ross. I'm a strategic advisor for the public sector at Ecopia. Prior to my time with Ecopia, I served 28 years in the public sector as a technical lead in leadership roles related to information management and GIS. I will be your facilitator today. We're talking data, and especially about how high-resolution geospatial data can assist you or your organization in planning, analysis, management, and decision-making as it relates to hazard mitigation, stormwater management, and climate resilience. Brandon Palin is the Senior Director of the Public Sector and International Development here at Ecopia. Brandon leads the development of Ecopia's AI global solutions in developing markets and oversees the North American public sector clients. Brandon holds a Master of Science in International Business from the Richard Ivey School of Business in Toronto, Canada, and a CEM's Master in International Management from the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. Katie Cromwell is a Senior Manager in Stormwater Management and Consulting Practice at Raftelis. Katie has a strong background in water regulation, permitting, compliance, and utility management. In her 7 years at Raftelis, she has consulted with numerous local governments on projects related to stormwater program development and review, and stormwater utility feasibility, development, and implementation studies. With a strong finance background, she possesses diverse and complementary knowledge and skills in data management and analysis, and has worked extensively with geospatial data with relational databases. Katie is an expert in census-based data analysis, data visualizations and mapping, and customer segmentation analysis, and has used these skills in association with many stormwater utility projects. Jeffrey Duke is a principal consultant for stormwater management and consulting practice at Raftelis as well. Jeffrey has over 32 years of experience in wastewater and stormwater utility industry with a focus in GIS, sewer infrastructure, inspection and evaluation, facilities planning, and stormwater program development. Jeff started his career as an intern for the City of Cincinnati Stormwater Management Utility prior to joining the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District in Cleveland, Ohio. At the Sewer District, Jeff served as GIS Services Manager for 17 years and was responsible for implementing and managing several information management systems, including the district's enterprise GIS and stormwater asset inventory and billing system with over 330,000 customers. Jeff is now a principal consultant with Raftelis in the stormwater management consulting practice, working with clients to identify and implement stable and sustainable financial practices and systems to help equitably fund their stormwater program needs over the long term. My thanks to each of you today for joining and sharing. Let's start out with Brandon. Hello, Brandon. Ecopia has come out with a high-resolution geospatial data that can clearly enable and benefit organizations and individuals who are involved in hazard mitigation, stormwater management, and climate resilience. Building climate resilience is a major focus in the public sector these days. Can you share a bit about how Ecopia has responded to that need for geospatial data to support climate resilience initiatives?
Thanks, Dan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Really looking forward to the conversation. And as Dan was saying, and before I kind of kick things off here, really looking forward to having some conversation with you guys. And please feel free to engage in those Q&A chats. At the end of the day, the goal of this is to be more of a conversational piece and to really bring together industry stakeholders to align interests, especially as it relates to geospatial data and supporting some of our most pressing issues of today. So with that, climate resiliency, I think that's it's a pretty broad term, and it's something that we're seeing quite often. On today's webinar, we have people, generally speaking, from North America, but really around the world, who are interested in the topic. And with that topic, one of the focuses in climate resiliency is understanding the environments of today, but also planning to understand the environments of tomorrow. And with that, geospatial data is a fundamental piece to understanding that. And structuring any sort of plan or any sort of fundamental analysis that is going to really strengthen a climate resiliency plan relies on a true and strong foundation. So when we talk about Ecopia, a geospatial data provider that's leveraging artificial intelligence to extract features from optical imagery sources, we like to think of the full cycle of data creation. And data creation here is starting from an understanding of what's not just needed today, but what's needed tomorrow and in the future, and maintenance of those data sets, and how are we going to continue to understand where not only we're seeing change today, but understanding that change of tomorrow. And effectively what that's doing is trying to optimize data creation so that we're aligning geospatial data solutions that are going to maximize economic and social impact. And part of the exciting piece of this webinar today is we have two sides to this. We have Ecopia, who's bringing the information as it relates to that geospatial data creation, but we also have industry leaders in Raftelis who are supporting public sector clients, not just in terms of geospatial data implementation, but their full programs that revolve around utilizing those data sources. So I'm really looking forward to talking more about these data sets, more about how our clients are using it from both federal, state, and municipal use cases, all the way through talking about some of the unique funding strategies that are available today. So thanks very much, Dan. Let me just go here. So with that, the value of high resolution data. Talking about why it is necessary, and the focus of this presentation, we could really talk about why geospatial data is necessary across a lot of divisions. And that's partly why we have 3 separate webinars over this series, because realistically, there is a lot of different use cases. And for us today, we're going to be focusing a lot on that climate solutions, specifically a lot related to the water conversation. And I think fundamentally speaking, everyone or most people in this call are going to understand why it's important to have access to this data. But to break down those numbers a little bit more, at the end of the day, what it starts with is urban sprawl and increased populations within urban settings. And with that, the development of man-made infrastructure. And with that development, what we've seen is significant increases of impervious surfaces that are impacting things like our clean water. So essentially drinking water for us, not to mention the impact on natural wetlands, or we're even talking about the population of habitats, whether it's fish migrations or the understanding of other wildlife patterns. And ultimately, what we're seeing is a significant impact across both the financial impact of this, meaning what are those disasters causing in the sense of increased flooding. We're also seeing increased pollution in water runoff areas. And with that, it's very much been a strategy about dealing with these problems after the fact. And for us, what we're trying to do is leverage geospatial data so that it's treating these ahead of that. And when I'm talking about these problems, they're really quite multifaceted. So when we talk about coastlines and storm surges, this is all fairly evident. Just less than a year ago, we saw the impact on Florida with the hurricanes. And one of the things that people don't realize is a lot of the devastation and the increased impact on those coast communities is because of the removal of a lot of natural landscapes. And with that removal, there hasn't been essentially increased planning to support the development of new green infrastructure or stormwater infrastructure to help deal with these impacts. And without having a fundamental understanding of where these impacts are taking place, it's very difficult to install infrastructure or put together any sort of supporting plan to help deal with it. Additionally, what we're seeing is the increased impact of urban heat. And urban heat is something that's talked about a lot more frequently now. We're seeing it even in terms of political reference or funding sources that are tied to promoting strategies that are going to mitigate these. But most critically, I would say, is that we're seeing the impact on this specifically with lower income communities. And lower income communities are, generally speaking, the ones that are bearing the brunt of the impact, especially when we see higher levels of impervious surface, less natural cover, and with that, a direct correlation in terms of people dying at a younger age or being exposed to extreme heat causing unnatural deaths as well. So significant impacts here that are all kind of rooted back in the concept of just understanding where our environments are changing, and with that, geospatial data playing a critical role again. And then the last piece that I'm going to talk about, really we could talk about natural changes and the impacts of climate change on a variety of sectors, but the last one that I'm going to discuss is wildfires. And wildfires, in terms of monitoring that, is generally speaking tied to the concept of canopy mapping and understanding where the highest risk communities are. One of the things that I found super interesting is a lot of first responders still don't have access to proper updated building footprint databases, so they're not fully reliant on actual up-to-date data to understand where populations are. So these are critical pieces of information that are super important, especially as we understand where to allocate funding and resources to support the development of modern infrastructure. And at the root of that is having an understanding of land use and land cover data. And this is where Ecopia comes into the play, and where we've been supporting our clients in trying to establish a new normal as it relates to data. And instead of thinking of data as just something that's being tooled for one solution, it's data to serve multiple purposes that can help our communities and help the public sector in these planning efforts.
Thanks for that, Brandon. Great background. That really helps us understand the data and the use cases a little bit better. Can you elaborate a little bit on some specific use cases that have leveraged the data, perhaps, and talk about the needs of perhaps where it's helping those organizations to meet their goals?
Yeah, 100%. I think, back up here. So the best way I found to articulate this is to understand a little bit about our clients. And Ecopia is working from scales of federal down through state and municipal. And fortunately, it's not just Ecopia on this call. So we also have Raftelis, who's going to do a great job of talking about how their users are on the municipal side and the more local government, of how they're leveraging geospatial data sets to address climate resiliency initiatives. But from my side, what I want to highlight is some of the critical elements that we're seeing, especially with our larger programs and some of our clients. So specifically, I like to highlight this initiative, are likely one of our largest initiatives, which is a project in partnership with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And it's a really exciting initiative where effectively all those coastal regions in dark blue there are getting access to high resolution land cover and land use data. And that data set is going to be impervious, tree canopy, open water layer that will be publicly accessible to those communities. And this is a data set that's actually well underway for creation and will be released this summer to access. So this is actually built off of funds received from the Infrastructure Act, and they're tailored to primarily an understanding pinning towards climate resiliency initiatives. So what they're using the data sets for is understanding flood impacts. They're looking at impervious surfaces and natural water runoff. Additionally, it's highlighting the use case of partner agencies. So although this is done in partnership with NOAA, the EPA has been involved with this. We've had separate discussions with several hazard mitigation teams and how they can leverage this data. And lastly, what it highlights is the opportunity for partnership amongst data creation. And when we talk about partnerships or data creation, this is kind of going to tie into that later piece of the discussion with funding and there being an opportunity to access these elements or access data sets, whether it's through these open data programs like this or access to higher resolution data sets in partnership, whether that's a state partnering with the federal agencies or municipal and state partnering together. Is there anything else, Dan, that you think would be critical to highlight from a federal standpoint here or other work we're doing on a larger scale with them?
Well, I know you have another couple use cases in mind. I think what's important here is it's really going to help those coastal areas with planning for their mitigations along those coastlines when we have significant climate events and planning their climate resilience strategy in those areas.
Agreed. So moving a little bit more on the granular side, and like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on our municipal clients because of our other partners that are on the line here. But I wanted to highlight two specific groups who are leveraging these data sets. And I'm starting off with Jacksonville because Jacksonville is a coastal community, obviously significantly impacted and in the path of, some of the most devastating hurricanes that we've seen. And with that, there's an increased efforts on their side to fund the development of stormwater management infrastructure. And like many other municipalities and regions across the country, they've had to resort to a stormwater utility fee to be able to implement and receive funds across their communities. The challenge, like many other groups, is that implementation is not necessarily the easiest thing. Historically, they were relying on average rates. They were only using commercial properties. And what they found is there was a lack of transparency involved with that. And that was creating additional challenges for them in terms of actually making it a public-facing fee and building support within the community, especially when they were relying on outdated information. And then the last piece was the cost of them creating the data sets was so significant that it was becoming difficult for them to maintain. So ultimately, that's where Ecopia came into the mix and was able to assist them in terms of building out a solution that is something that's a sustainable plan for long-term direction. So ultimately, what we're able to deliver to them is a solution in under 4 weeks where they get a full impervious and natural landscape feature identification. So you can see the scope of that, over 360,000 parcels, and at a cost that is 84% less than what they were doing previously. So that's one of the elements there, is simply the cost side of things. But I always like to highlight some of these key points, especially from stakeholders. They're accurately and efficiently calculated. So one of the primary questions we see with leveraging AI or an AI-based product is the concept of accuracy. And what we like to say is, yes, we're leveraging artificial intelligence for extraction, but we're using it as a tool for efficiency. And that tool is essentially what enables us to be able to provide a data set that is created at a GIS professional accuracy and can be passed through to our clients so that they can still make it a public facing solution. So briefly, just to show exactly what kind of that looks like, just provide some concepts. So in the scope of this project, we leveraged their aerial imagery to do the data extraction and outputted a high resolution vector map that, as you can see, is quite precise. One of the elements here that we do, and I also like to highlight, is that we capture the individual tree canopy in addition to the underlying impervious. So when it relates to stormwater utility fees, obviously for them, they want to have that true underlying impervious because that's what the fee's calculated for. But on the other side, their environmental departments and Department of Environmental Planning wanted to understand the urban tree canopy impact. So this is all about that concept of building data sets that are used not just for one client, but for supporting multiple use cases to support these climate resiliency strategies across the board. The last one that I want to highlight is the City of Detroit. And the City of Detroit has been a unique partner of Ecopia since for over 5 years now. And what I want to specifically highlight within this is the concepts of change. So as I said at the start of the webinar, when we talk about geospatial data being a solution within stormwater management, hazard mitigation planning, or even in this sense, the stormwater utility fee application, a lot of people, or a lot of groups, I should say, are leveraging historically outdated information. So what we've seen is a lot of groups updating their data sets on whether it's, sometimes just a 3-year cycle, 5-year cycle. Some are even using 10-year-old data. And what they don't realize is the impact that can have in terms of those measurements. So as we look at the City of Detroit, as we do annual updates for them, on average, what we've seen is a discrepancy of about 2% change in their surfaces every year. And what that results in is about a $5.6 million discrepancy on their stormwater utility fee. So for an area that's about 100 square miles, that's pretty darn significant. And the last thing that I want to highlight about this is our process of working with groups to be able to maximize the opportunity across the value spectrum. And as I said from the start, our goal is to align geospatial solutions that produce the maximum economic and social impact. And with that, we become not just a data provider, but a partner of our clients. And that's highlighted by Dan Rainey, the Chief Information Officer there in Detroit. He talks about us as being a trusted partner and a critical component for the City of Detroit, as they've been able to not only leverage those impervious layers, but also support other departments at the city as they expanded the scope of the data set to include those natural layers, which I can show you here. So this has been a pretty high level description or overview of those products. And the goal of this was to kind of give some examples of how municipalities are using data sets, how federal organizations are using data sets, but ultimately highlight the value in having that up-to-date information. So yeah, that's it from my side in terms of those background case studies before we pass it over to our friends at Raftelis.
So thanks for that, Brandon. As I was listening to you, and based on your description of both the data and the case study, it sounds like the data is not only highly accurate, but can save organizations a significant amount of time versus traditional methods of data capture as well.
Yeah, I think that's the whole, a big piece of this is, historically data creation has been something that is time consuming, resource intensive. It's not something that's been thought of as an ability to sustainably create and maintain. And our message is that, we really want to work with not only municipalities or state or even the public sector, but other firms who are supporting their clients with these solutions to be able to provide a more sustainable data creation process that can be utilized across not just one department or one solution, and across the spectrum. And I think that's where that win-win scenario really comes into play, and also brings a great opportunity to bring in Raftelis to talk about, how their clients are using the data and a little bit more on that consulting side of how they've been working with groups to implement these programs.
Indeed. And we are indeed fortunate today to have Jeff Duke and Katie Cromwell from Raftelis, who, amongst many other things, are leveraging that geospatial data that you've been talking about to benefit local government and utility management organizations. Jeff and Katie, thanks for joining today and sharing your story. Can you tell us a little bit more about Raftelis and your use of geospatial data to help local governments and utilities thrive?
Yes, absolutely. So diving into it, kind of as Brandon did that great setup, and he alluded to earlier in the discussion that we at Raftelis are utility and local government financial and management consultants. And as part of the stormwater management consulting practice that Jeff and I are a part of, we focus specifically on stormwater related funding strategies. And Brandon and I are going to have a little bit more broad of a discussion on funding a little bit later. But for this section, we're going to focus on one stormwater funding approach, which is stormwater utilities. So Brandon already gave great examples with Jacksonville and Detroit. And we're going to talk kind of in more detail about the important role that geospatial data plays in stormwater utility creation and long-term operation of the utility. And we also have some case studies to share as well. So talking a little bit more about who is Raftelis, like I said, we're utility and local government financial and management consultants. And we have more than 160 consultants scattered across the U.S. I see in the chat that we have some people from North Carolina, and Raftelis is actually headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We operate primarily in the U.S., but we do operate internationally with some clients in Canada as well as down in the Caribbean. And in addition to our stormwater management consulting practice, we also have a water and wastewater financial consulting practice. We have a management consulting practice that does things like strategic planning and organizational assessments for local governments and utilities. We have a data services practice that builds custom pieces of software for utility clients. And we have a technology practice that where we help clients with the identification and implementation of billing systems, customer information systems, and computerized maintenance management systems. And so diving into our topic today, often as stormwater programs mature and grow, communities tend to switch their funding approach to a parcel-based funding approach, which is typically based on impervious area. And this funding approach obviously has a heavy geospatial component, which makes it a great topic for today's discussion. And our stormwater consulting practice specializes in stormwater utility creation, and we've successfully helped over 60 communities implement their own stormwater utility, and have worked with many others to further refine their stormwater programs, rate structures, and utility operations. And because stormwater fees are parcel-based and utilize impervious area-based rate structures, it's no surprise that geospatial data is a very foundational component to all stormwater utilities. And stormwaters are being charged actual fees based on parcel impervious area data characteristics. So fundamentally, to maintain customer confidence in the fee, high quality geospatial data is absolutely essential. And so I'm going to talk really quickly about how many stormwater utility fees work. So often customer classes are determined using parcel data, often assessing data, and most commonly customer classes are divided into single family residential and non-single family. And so as you can see on the left, there are two residential properties where the impervious area on the property is delineated and shown in transparent blue. And the impervious area associated with a typical single family residential property is determined through a sampling process, and this value represents what is typically called the equivalent residential unit, or ERU, for the community. And the ERU can be thought of as the unit of charge for stormwater. So like how you may be charged for water in increments of 1,000 gallons, for stormwater you would be charged based on the number of ERUs on your property. And on the right is a non-single family residential property. So for example, if the impervious area on that property is 8 times the amount of impervious surface area on a typical single family residential property in the community, then they will be charged 8 times more than the single family residential property. And so this maintains rate equivalency and ensures equity between the customer classes. And this desire for equity in funding is really a big driver that many communities have when considering implementing a stormwater utility. There are obviously many complex financial, policy, programmatic considerations to think about when developing a stormwater utility and fee. So this is kind of an example, typical approach that we follow when we're implementing a brand new utility or fee from scratch. So just to walk you through it, you have to have a stormwater program. You have to know how much it costs and what the associated revenue requirements are. And then looking at the rate structure, you have to decide on what rate structure you're going to use. And that includes doing things like determining the equivalent residential unit that we talked about and determining kind of the total number of units of service in your community. And then from there, once we have the revenue requirements and we have the units of service, we can determine what the rates should be. So then we have to kind of transition to thinking about the data associated with the stormwater fee, thinking about how it can be stored and maintained over time as property characteristics change. People tear down houses and build new ones, and properties are subdivided and recombined over time, and the stormwater utility has to be able to keep pace with that. And then we have to consider how the fee is actually going to make it onto customers' bills. So we spend a lot of time working with billing systems to integrate the appropriate data to be able to calculate and convey customer fees accurately. And then finally, because this is a brand new fee, the legal instrument has to be created. Often it's in the form of an ordinance establishing the utility. And last but absolutely not least, I hate that it kind of comes last in here, is public outreach and communications to make sure that the public and all stakeholders are aware of the upcoming fee and stormwater utility and what the stormwater program is doing for their community. And, building understanding through mapping can have a huge role in that engagement with the public. So as we've discussed, geospatial data plays a foundational role in stormwater utilities and the determination of fees. And Jeff is going to talk a little bit more about how that geospatial data can be set up to kind of enhance not only understanding about the stormwater fee, but other activities in the community related to stormwater as well.
All right, thanks, Katie. So as Katie has discussed with that previous slide, that billing data, as well as the associated data management systems and processes, they are critical to a successful stormwater program implementation project. But just as critical is that role that's been discussed of what geospatial data can do. And that role is what the data does in terms of building your understanding with your stakeholders. And we're talking about all types of stakeholders here. So, for example, let's take this picture, this aerial image. And when you add those data layers and put it into that spatial context, the resulting simple map helps you understand a lot more about what's going on with the property. The data becomes more valuable, and it helps you build that understanding. So for the individual stakeholder here, the customer, the property owner, when provided access to this simple map showing their impervious area and their parcel boundary, they can answer a key question. How much IA do I have on my property? And how much will that be used to calculate my stormwater fee? Continuing on, from a stakeholder perspective, here's another example showing a more complex map, integrating several different data sets, several different types of data as well. Your vector data, your video data, your tabular information here. Your stakeholder might be a decision maker, such as a field crew leader responsible for the inspection of a stream asset. And they need access to that information to help them build the understanding, that theme again, that role again, build the understanding that they need to answer several questions, such as what data is available for this stream asset to help me aid my analysis that I need to perform. What are the field conditions at this location? The video helps to answer that so we can complete our work safely and efficiently. What previous assessments might be available that can help me inform my current recommendation, for rehab or for problem solving. So you may start to see that as you build data sets for whatever your program need is, climate resiliency, sustainability, stormwater program, you need to be thoughtful and organized and integrate these geospatial frameworks to help your users, your stakeholders, access all types of data so they can build their understanding to enhance their analysis and improve their outcomes. As we continue forward to the final example here, you'll see that you might be faced with a broad stakeholder audience or many stakeholders, customers, government officials, politicians, service providers, consultants, contractors, your coworkers within your organization. You can use your spatial data to help tell a story here, as the case shown here of a story map being used to show details of a stormwater utilities design and construction program. What's going on, at what stages are projects at? Are they in design? Are they in construction? Are they complete? Where are they at related to the stream assets and so forth? This application that was provided helps answer the 5W questions. What is the problem? Who is impacted? How will it be solved? When and where will construction occur? What are the benefits or the outcomes? All of these questions can be answered using your geospatial data and what applications you use to provide access to that data to help build understanding of your complex program. So building understanding is not the only goal or philosophical approach to consider here. We've talked about that a lot with the last few examples here. There are a couple of other capabilities that I think you should keep in mind when it comes to sharing your geospatial data or when it comes to building your geospatial data framework, especially for the utility and local government sector. This shown here with this graphic, scalable and flexible that are shown at the bottom and above, understandable here. So first, as you're thinking about building a geospatial framework, you need to start with a solid foundation. You want to make sure that your data and systems are scalable, able to be expanded upon, built upon, and handle the changing demands that may be placed upon it in the future. I see that geospatial data as a foundation for all your other data sets and systems, and having a strong, solid foundation is key to future success there. So, second, as we previously mentioned, you want your data to be understandable. You don't need to be have a PhD, to be able to use your data to solve a problem and to answer a question. You want to make sure your data is accessible and believable, especially to all your constituents and stakeholders there. So finally, once your framework is built, you want to make sure that you have that flexibility in your data so you can adapt and share your data. We'll talk about that in a couple of the case studies here coming up here. But as we've seen in the past few years, times change, and we must be able to evolve and adapt and be transparent. I think gone are the days of keeping data internally and not sharing it. So I wish there was more time to go into depth on these topics. So I do want to encourage you, if you have any questions on this or any of the previous points brought up, please feel free to post them in the chat tool, and we'll do our best to answer. And right now, I'd like to turn it back over to Katie to share some details on a couple of case studies here from recently completed stormwater utility implementations. Katie?
All right. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is New Hanover County, North Carolina. And they're a client that we worked with several years ago to set up a stormwater program and fee. And I think this case study ties really nicely back into Brandon's discussion earlier on coastlines and storm surge and the NOAA case study as well. Because New Hanover County is located on the coast of North Carolina, and is particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events like hurricanes, as well as climate-related impacts like sea level rise. And in the unincorporated county, a large amount of their stormwater infrastructure is made up of open ditches, like what is shown in the picture on the top right. They also have areas of really dense development in the unincorporated areas of the county, more so than you would typically expect, because water and sewer service has been extended beyond the incorporated boundaries, allowing for that more dense development. And kind of a combination of these factors led them to developing a stormwater program where they could more adequately maintain their stormwater infrastructure as a system and fund it in a stable and equitable way. They also wanted their stormwater program and fee revenue to include equipment purchases and emergency preparedness activities to better allow them to be responsive in the event of increasingly more common extreme weather events. So, for example, they wanted to purchase more pumps that they could pre-position in low-lying areas prone to flooding in the event of an projected hurricane. And the implementation of their stormwater program and fee has been considered a huge success. There was a lot of public support for this program, and in 2022, they won a County Resiliency Award from the National Association of Counties for their stormwater program that was developed as part of this project. So I think it's a really great example of how stormwater utilities and geospatial data all play, huge roles at the local government level in terms of identifying stable funding mechanisms and being able to use that funding to address some extreme events like climate-related impacts. And with that, I think Jeff is going to talk about the next example, which is in Ohio.
Thanks, Katie. So this case study I want to talk about is the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. And this is where I worked with Raftelis to help build the stormwater management program. And we built the stormwater geospatial data infrastructure there to support that program. There's many drivers that the district face in terms of why they had to implement the stormwater program. One was legislative. There was a court order mandate to solve regional stormwater problems, and regional problems were increasing within the city of Cleveland and the surrounding 60 plus suburbs that touch 44 different counties there. So there was many people involved with some service providing, but nobody was really the lead on providing the solutions to solving these regional stormwater management problems there. So some of the program needs that were identified throughout facility planning efforts was that there was basically, to solve the problems on a regional level, you needed about a $40 million a year revenue source. And that's what was created for the district service area there. And within that revenue source, the key program roles were provided of facilities planning, design, construction, inspection, maintenance, and other related activities, including encouraging good stormwater management practices. Also, one of the key roles that was provided was some regional collaboration on the large volume of geospatial data sets that was available. Stormwater mapping, MPDES, Phase 2, stormwater permit databases for water quality inspections for illicit discharge detection and elimination. Many databases were created, and I could go on about that, but I don't want Dan to give me the hook on time here. So I just want to wrap up and maybe highlight something that Brandon and touch on something Brandon said earlier was the term partnerships. So one of the things that the district did was collaborate with many external stakeholders in sharing their data sets. And one of the key data sets that they shared a lot of was the Impervious area. there was a lot of people that were interested in the impervious area data set, not just from a billing perspective, but it was also used to support a lot of hydraulic and hydrologic modeling for facilities planning analysis and problem and solution determination. Additionally, there were the county planning agencies and other natural resource groups were doing collaborative tree canopy studies, so the impervious area data sets were used to share with that. And several sustainability projects also used the impervious area data sets, solar planning efforts and such there. And one of the most recent things that I was involved with was an environmental justice analysis, starting to use that impervious area data to see to break down certain demographic areas to see how much land cover and IA was available where certain problems were, to see if there was some inequitable trends there. So in the spirit of collaboration, that's something to keep considering, building those partnerships with your data. And overall, I think Dan mentioned before, trying to keep the cost of creating data down as much as possible. The collaboration and sharing help that, through many of those stakeholders there. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to get us to our funding portion here.
Yeah, thanks, Katie and Jeff. Those were great examples of use cases. And as you were talking about it, I saw myself thinking about the importance of the geospatial data in the analysis, in the conversations with the decision makers about where to take that analysis in terms of setting fees and those sorts of things. And then finally, in terms of supporting the public when they come in and say, hey, what's this new assessment that I have and how did you arrive at that? So those are really great use cases. But I do want to get on to funding. And I know we have another slide to share there and some information, because that's part of moving this whole conversation along. Is now that we know this data is available, how do we fund it? Katie, let's start with you.
All right, so we have talked a lot about stormwater utilities today, but there are many ways that communities fund stormwater and fund the creation of geospatial data related to stormwater. And that can include tax funding, special assessments. Some communities fund stormwater with water or wastewater fee revenue. And then there are things like grants and debt funding that are used to supplement any of these funding strategies. And depending on your community, any of these funding approaches may be suitable. It just really depends on your stormwater needs, your stormwater program, the characteristics of your community. Do you have any regulatory drivers or court orders that are in place related to your management of stormwater? And we really work with communities to select a funding approach that best fits their needs. But determining kind of the right approach and the right mix of funding can be a little bit challenging. And so the first thing we often work with communities to do is think about, do you have a stormwater funding strategy at all? And is it working for you? Maybe if you're using tax funding primarily, are you getting the needed revenue that you need to fund and maintain and improve your stormwater system over time? And if that's the case, maybe that's the best option for you. And do you have a stormwater fee in place, and should you consider one? And if you do have one, does it need updating either to increase the revenue or better align with the needs and characteristics of the community? And often we see people consider stormwater utilities as their stormwater needs increase and costs increase. And there's a strong desire to have a very stable revenue source that is very equitable. So for example, if you're funding your program with tax funding, properties like tax exempt properties aren't really contributing towards paying for stormwater when really they probably should. The next thing we think about are, how are you funding stormwater capital? And are you funding it all with cash, or are you issuing debt either general obligation bonds or revenue bonds based on, your fee revenue from your stormwater utility, and are capital projects being completed in a timely fashion, or are you always being responsive? Or, is there a better way you could use your geospatial data to improve how you're approaching capital projects so that you aren't as reactive? And then if, the answer is we really need to accelerate our capital program, then maybe considering things like debt might be a good option. And then finally, I think this last piece is so important to think about, especially in the environment we're in right now. Are you well positioned to receive grant funding? We are in such a unique position where we have a once in a generation funding opportunities. And so communities really need to be well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities, like the ARPA funding, like the BRIC funding, and all the infrastructure related funding, because it's not going to be there forever. And so making sure that you have the framework in place to be able to apply for those grants when those come up, I think is a really important consideration. And so I think
thanks for that.
We are indeed slightly over. However, we still have a little bit of time. Katie, I think it's an extremely important piece of the equation here. At the end of the day, funding is arguably one of the most significant challenges that groups face when it comes to both procuring data, but also in terms of sustaining these programs. And just to briefly highlight, I'd say there's as you said, there's once in a lifetime opportunities right now, especially from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, in addition to the Inflation Reduction Act. What we're seeing is language in those that is tied directly to flood mitigation, hazard mitigation, understanding your forest areas to monitor for fire risk. And with that, there's a lot of tie points. So I highly recommend any user that's interested in saying, hey, we want this data, we're looking for this data for our community, but we currently don't necessarily have a way to make it happen, to reach out, because we do have the unique opportunity to help support and liaise with both federal and state partners to help pull this together. So that's it on my side for the funding. Dan, let me pass it back to you, and we can hopefully address a few of these questions that are coming through.
Great. Let's move over to the audience and see what we have for questions in the Q&A. It does look like there are a couple. From Kevin Noel, what would the process be to expand this type of service, high resolution cover land use data sets for other small island developing states in the Caribbean?
Great question, Kevin. So the great thing about data creation is so long as there's imagery, there's a way for us to extract it. And I think Katie also mentioned that Raftelis is likewise doing project planning in some of the Caribbean areas. So the solution itself it's not location dependent. We have resources to do these projects both in North America, the Caribbean. To kind of tag onto the question next, are there any examples in Canada? Yes. We're working very closely with Bruce County, the city of Peterborough, in addition to the city of Ottawa. So lots of great use cases there. And the geographic location in terms of how we're doing these projects, there's certainly a level of variability to that, but that doesn't mean that we cannot support these pretty much anywhere in the world.
Thanks for that, Brandon. There is another question out there from Gino. Is the AI technology embedded into the ArcGIS platform classification tool? So
all of Ecopia's technology is effectively proprietary data solutions. So what that means is we're leveraging the AI technology to extract the data, but we're providing you with that end product in the sense of it being a shapefile, GeoJSON, geodatabase, and then that can be embedded directly into an ARC program, or for that matter, any other software. So for example, if Raftelis was doing some level of analysis and they have their own software, so long as it's compatible with any sort of standard geospatial product, they would be able to do the level of integration and analysis as needed. Katie, I'm not sure if you want to, or Jeff want to expand on your use of any sort of Esri or ARC products. I'm not sure if it necessarily relates, but I'll definitely give you the opportunity to.
I don't think there's anything specific that I would add. I added in the chat that we're also working with Calgary and Victoria as a couple of other Canadian examples. So there are definitely those out there as well.
What I would say is there is an example of the Peterborough on the Ecopia website, Brandon, if I believe correctly, that somebody can go out, take a look at and see that data. I want to touch on one more question here, and we need to wrap up. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Monica, you asked where there might be grants available. A good place to start is, I hate to send anybody to a federal site, but it's called grants.gov. And there's lots of things listed there. And then, as Brandon said, reach out to us. We have some ideas on how you can engage in funding opportunities as well. So with that, I want to wrap up. I want to say thank you to our speakers today. It was really great to have you, and I appreciated the great use cases that you shared, and especially our audience and our participants today. Thank you for attending and taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about geospatial data for climate resilience and hazard and stormwater management.